Welcome back. We're back in ZBrush, and I wanted to give you guys a quick little tour of my favorite brushes and some of the modifiers that are important when sculpting in ZBrush. As anybody who's looked through the menu with all the brushes know, there are a ton of brushes that are available to use, and we're going to try to, well, at least I am going to try to focus on the ones I use the most. You guys are all fairly experienced with ZBrush, so you're welcome to uh, use whatever is in your toolkit already, but I just wanted to show you my workflow because that's why some of you are here. Okay, so I've loaded this torso fragment, and I have my SE double shade material, so you can see that it reacts to light and everything, kind of nice. It has the wax modifier on too, so we're getting a little bit of wax glow. And now, so I'll step through kind of my go-to brushes. And when I talk about my go-to brushes, I know exactly what they are because I have them mapped to 1 to 9 on the numpad. Right, so all of those are the ones that I have on demand on a keystroke. Okay, and the first one is probably what everybody should have mapped, which is the standard brush. And it really is one of the most useful brushes, regardless of what level of resolution you're working on. Just quickly, I'm going to get rid of my polyframe coloration because that annoys me. So anybody who wants to do this, you can go to Draw, make polyframe gray, and you can turn polyframe fill down. That will just get rid of the coloration. Hopefully you have in your mind what your polygroups are, but generally I don't want to see the coloration. Okay, so back to standard brush. Standard brush is useful because it pushes and pulls along the normal, right? So I'm just going to give some demos on this model. This is all pretty self-explanatory. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but standard brush, straight in and out, right? There's nothing with Alt being my modifier, right? So there's nothing especially profound about this, but it's very useful for going in and creating creases. And when I'm talking about creases, I'm not really talking about pinching. I'm talking about just kind of really defining something or cutting into the model. For example, right here along the chest, if I go up, what I'll generally do is I'll just kind of go with a nice soft stroke. The intensity down a little bit. And you can see that I can control the focal shift on this as well. And what I do as I'm working is I adjust my brush size continuously, right? So if I'm trying to get this sharper, and again, I just kind of make my brush smaller and smaller and run the same stroke along. It's really good for tightening things. So say I wanted this a little bit deeper, a little bit tighter. You know, I could run a stroke along here like this. And actually, this is a very kind of smooth, continuous curve. So this might be a case where you'd want to increase your lazy mouse radius a little bit. So you can see I start to have a following trail. And you can go even higher, and you can make it really, really continuous. This is a little bit annoying, though, because it goes a little bit too slow. Okay. So you'll see in my workflow, I'll talk about the standard brush when I have it up. But it's in my tool chest for those occasions when I am not using the clay brushes, which we'll get to in a little while. Because really the clay brushes are great for building up surfaces, but when you want to subtract surface or push in, you'll see they don't perform in the same way. So often I'll switch between standard brush and clay brush. Okay, so that's number one, standard. Everybody should keep that. I generally use it with modifiers in the focal shift, lazy mouse, and also if you want to get really sharp cutting, can grab some of the small alphas, and you're talking about cutting really fine details then. So really tight strokes. Okay, so I'll turn that off, and we'll go to number 2, which I have mapped to the move brush. And regardless of whether you're working on a model with topology like this, right? So we have levels of subdivision and some kind of topology, which we'll use occasionally, or whether you're working with Dynamesh, move brush is still really useful. I really like it when I'm working on a mesh that has kind of a low resolution starting point, whether I've generated that from Z-spheres or from a base mesh. Because what the move brush allows you to do is really quickly adjust proportions at the lowest level, right? So if I want to just kind of contour the neck a little bit, I'm just pulling individual points, and I'm not really grabbing a volume. So it's a really good way when you're refining your mesh or adjusting proportions to make big changes to your model that are artifact free. And by artifact free, I mean they're not introducing any kind of dimples or convexities in your surface. Like if you're trying to pull out at this level, you can start to see that it introduces tiny little changes and is a little bit less controlled. You can see a little bit of edge popping up there from the border of my brush. And in the extreme, you can kind of see it here, right? So in principle, when I'm really trying to get the right gesture and pose for my brush or my model, I will modify some of this on the lowest level, right? If we just are going to thin her out a little bit, I'm pushing individual points around as opposed to working on a higher level. So a little nip and a tuck at the lowest subdivision goes a long way and really respects the details that you have up higher, right? So they all move kind of in unison with the lowest subdivision, right? So you can adjust that and have all your details preserved. So in an extreme case, right, if I really wanted to pull the chest out and make her some kind of deformed monster, I just whack that out. And what I'm actually doing right here with the move brush is I'm using the Alt modifier, and rather than pulling, I'm just doing Alt and drag, and it's moving out along the normal, which is another thing I use quite frequently. All right, so higher level details are respected, and they travel along with the base mesh. Okay, so I'll undo that, get back to normal, roughly normal. So again, I'll show you on maybe an intermediate level what the Alt modifier does with the move brush. So I'll typically use it if I'm kind of working on a silhouette or something and I just want to, and can't necessarily drag. I want to make sure that it's kind of going along the normal, and I'll use the Alt modifier to just push out or push in. All right, so become familiar with that. When you're working in Dynamesh, the move tool is great for pulling out parts and then remeshing. I'm not going to remesh right now because just leave the subdivisions for a minute. Okay, so number 3 that I have mapped in my favorite brushes is Nudge. And Nudge is a little bit of it's a little bit legacy in that I use it only on occasions that I'm really interested in pushing the topology around. So I use it a lot for facial expressions where I'm sliding smile kind of edges over the surface or bunching up wrinkles. So in general sculpting workflow, I don't use it a lot, kind of maquette workflow, but you can see it just pushes along the normal, perpendicular to the normal, so along the surface. If you are doing things like this or adjusting kind of the flow of edges from a Z-sphere model, or even your own base mesh is good for kind of getting the flow going in the right direction, right? So I used it without really violating the form. So I'll use it for that. So if I wanted to kind of tighten up the edge loops going underneath the breasts, I could slide those up like this. Likewise, or kind of adjust the abdomen a little bit. Okay, so that's nudge. Number 4 is pinch. Pinch is a very good brush for tightening edges. And anybody who's kind of done production work with displacement maps or normal maps know that pinching your mesh isn't a great thing for translating that into an asset. But for just general maquette workflow, it's pretty useful. And the thing about it is, you can see it's dependent on the size, right? How much it pulls. But also, you can use the Z-add or Z-subtract modifier to tell the brush whether it's pinching and pushing in or pinching and pulling out, right? So you can create a ridge by pinching and pulling out. So you can see it's popping up ever so slightly. It's created some, in addition to pulling the edges together, it's created a little bit of an elevation. Or if I undo that and use the Alt modifier as I go down, you can see it's pushing in. Okay, and this brings us to the first mention of something called the embed for the, actually in the brush modifier. So if I pull up all the brush modifiers, you can see we have quite a few things. Actually, the one we're looking at here is not embed. Embed is what we'll get to with the clay tubes and other things like that. But what we're looking at for the pinch is brush modifier, which essentially pulls up or pushes in the surface. So if you really wanted to create an elevation as you're sculpting, maybe try setting this to 100, and it'll pinch and really pull up, right? Or more often I use it to create creases, so it'll pinch and really push in. Create a crease all the way up the chest. A little too much, but you get the idea. So if you were just pulling edges together without any elevation or depression, you put the brush modifier to 0. And then you would see that this just kind of pulls the edges together without any change in surface elevation. Right. So that's that. Okay, but generally I like to push in a little bit, so I leave the modifier at 20 and use it from there. Again, for our maquette workflow and actually for things like Dynamesh and working that way, the pinch tool is really nice and is very useful. So again, I'll just kind of go down here. With Alt enabled, I'm pushing in as I sculpt. And again, for these kind of curves, just like we saw with the standard brush, Lazy Mouse is quite useful. And while I'm on it, I'll show you another trick. So if I'm going to just kind of crease this ever so gently, send it all the way up there, we'll see what happens. I might have too large of a cursor. So I've made one stroke. A really cool thing to get this to go along the same line is to go to stroke, replay last. And it will actually repeat your last stroke again and again and again and again and again. And you can see that we're pushing in ever so slightly, but we're getting really, really creased. Right, so that's now become a really fine crease. And because we had the Lazy Mouse enabled, it really it really made this a nice, smooth, gradual stroke. Way too sharp for our purposes, but you get the idea. So another thing that I'll do now, if I've kind of pulled all this in, I'll put the polyframe back on, is because you have such a nice collection of edges kind of doubled up on themselves, really pulled in, what you're able to do is you can, one, use the smooth brush, and right now I'm going in with shift and smoothing out these adjacent areas kind of to hide a little bit of the pull. But what you can easily do now, because you have such a nice collection of edges, is if you switch back to the standard brush, you can really easily and cleanly push these in as a collection without having to be too precise. I'm going to turn my lazy radius down a little bit. I can really push those in, and you can see a few artifacts building up, but those are easily worked out with the smooth brush either side. So that's some of the workflow for creating creases. We'll see this again and again as we start to refine the mesh, our meshes, our sculpts. For example, in here, if we want to kind of propagate this fold, go to pinch, lazy mouse on, decent radius, alt enabled to push in a little bit, push that out, and I'll do stroke replay last. You see it's getting a little bit tighter. Switch to standard. Again, from the number 1 button on my numpad. Push that in, maybe push up the top edge bit, right? So push the wrinkle in, and now I'm kind of folding it over the top. And then a smooth brush over top of all of that will give a nice, nice inflection. Okay, so we got a little bit of fold there. That was pretty nice and easy to put in. We want to look at it a little better. I just pull up my light and I'll adjust the light just to see how well it's handling under different viewing conditions. And this is really important to be able to assess the different things that you're working on. Okay, so there's a little wrinkle using the pinch and the standard. I'll put this back to straight on. Okay, so that was number 4. Number 5 is inflate. Inflate is great for the Dynamesh stuff. In fact, let's just do this. I'm going to duplicate this tool, and I'll make one of these a Dynamesh. I'll go to move one over here, and we're not seeing both because I have solo on, solo off. So let's make one of these Dynamesh. I'll make this one Dynamesh. So go to draw, and I'll enable Dynamesh. It has multiple subdivision levels. Let me just delete the lower. So I go down to geometry and hit delete lower. Recording, okay, bake all, and delete lower. So anybody who's used layers knows that there's all kinds of restrictions on what you can do with the geometry when a layer is recording. Okay, so I'll just quickly Dynamesh this. So there we go, Dynamesh, and you can see that it actually pulls all this together. But often for Dynamesh, when something goes wrong, or when you really want to, say, pull out an arm a little further, pull this out, or if you happen to get something really small, Dynamesh control drag to remesh. I'll often inflate the little thing that comes out. So this is why I hotkey things, because I hate looking through this huge volume of brushes. Even with the B command, and then the kind of filtering is still quite slow. So if you have a set of brushes that you use all the time, you should map them. So now on the Dynamesh, inflate can just bring these round areas out to a good proportion without having to do much. You can push in or pull out. For example, this leg, ay caramba, this is starting to look really bad for a quick demo, but you get the idea. Like I'll inflate this just to get it round again. And then from there, we're just kind of putting volume in an easy way. And then we can use things like the clay brush to really kind of contour it and make it look nice. So that's inflate on Dynamesh. Let me go to the other subtool, and I'll just show you other areas where I use inflate. Inflate is very useful in areas like under the arm, or where you're trying to bring surface together that press, and you just really want to get all of it, but the standard brush. So say I want to push this surface a little bit towards the chest and really kind of have things bulge up. Standard brush isn't great for getting in there, but inflate does a nice job. If I inflate both surfaces evenly, you can see it starts to press, and I can do this up here. And that's really kind of what happens when, when the skin comes together. You get a nice big kind of buckle or a little bit of a bulge where it comes together. Another thing you can use with this is something called topological masking. Say I just wanted to inflate the side of the arm towards the chest and not want chest to inflate towards the arm. Under the brush menu, you have, under the masking modifiers, something called topological masking. And topological masking essentially just says if I'm on different edges of topology, which means around the corner, so this is totally different than this. There's a space between the two. Then it will prevent something on one side from affecting the other. Okay, so let me just step up in resolution, and we'll just do this with the inflate. So if I hit it over here, you see that it's only inflating this side and not the chest. Okay, subtract that. And the smoothness and the range of all this happens to be influenced by those two modifiers that you looked at, right? So range and smooth. I don't modify them a lot. I mostly use topological for the move brush when I'm pulling vertices and stuff, but play with those to get the effect that you want. Okay, so that's inflate. Very nice. And now 6, the morph brush, I will talk about briefly. The morph brush I really use as my bread and butter when I'm doing facial expressions or blend shapes where you're storing a lot of morph targets. However, it actually is pretty useful in other areas, so I'll just talk a little bit about how it works. And the thing about it is that you have to have a morph target stored. So if I delete morph target and store morph target, essentially I'm creating a snapshot of this mesh at this resolution, which is 6 subdivisions. Right, so there's a snapshot in there of this without edits. And so right now I can go crazy doing things on my mesh, and this is going to be a little bit dirty, but it will illustrate the point. So if I go with my standard brush and I turn my thing to spray dots, and I grab just like an alpha like this, I'm essentially going to give her all sorts of lumps and bumps, and I'll just whack up the intensity. And this is just to illustrate how the morph brush works. So that's fine. I go to 6 for Morph Brush, and really I'm just kind of, as you brush on the surface, you're blending it back. All right, so essentially it's useful for doing something and then, like I said, blending it back. In a kind of a standard workflow, character figure workflow, where I often use this is if I'm in the detailing stages and I want to kind of put in some surface irregularities, or often something like a vein, right? So if I was going to do a vein, you can see I just kind of made that natural and very kind of selectively chicken-pocked. If I was going to do a vein on the surface of her, veins are quite hard because they dive in and out of the superficial fascia, and they have kind of valves that make them bump and do funny things, right? But if you're kind of if you're using the morph targets, you can. I'm just going to make a standard brush with. I'll do freehand, no lazy mouse. So I'm just going to kind of sculpt in a little vein. Turn the intensity down a little bit so we're not doing ridiculous. So that's quite extreme, right? I'll take a little smooth brush and maybe smooth some of the edges off this. Turn the intensity of my smooth brush down. But often you don't want to just smooth it out because smooth will destroy the character of the vein, but you want to give it a little bit of variation that you didn't achieve when you're laying it down with a standard brush. So I'll go with the morph brush, and I can just go in and essentially selectively erase parts of this. So really kind of go in and push in areas. Make some areas harder. Make it a little more naturalistic. Some places it dives in, comes out again. And actually, an interesting thing about the morph brush that not a lot of people know is that if you use morph brush with an alt modifier or go to Z subtract, it actually does the opposite of blending it on, and it puts more of the difference between your target and what you have already in. So it's good for putting accents. So blending between on and off. So morphing away and then morphing on. Right, so morphing on, Z subtract just gives me a lot. So it's a good way to essentially selectively enhance your details. And that's still a lot, so I'm going to go with a little kind of a very broad morph back. Kind of brushing this back to the surface. This is where a little bit of artistry comes in, right? So obviously she's a woman. She's not going to have huge veins, but especially running down the back of her shoulder like this, which is not where they go. But we'll talk about that later. Okay, so that's a little bit why I have the morph brush in my workflow, right? Because it's useful for these kind of things. I'll just pop this out of it using morph brush in subtract mode. Polyframe off. You see there's really rough. It looks like a really nasty varicose vein, but we'll go back to the front. Okay, so that's morph. Quickly working to the next one, we get to the magic brushes. Okay, we've kind of played around with 1 to 6, but 7 and 8 are really my bread and butter for building up maquettes and studies. And this is clay on 7, and number 8 is clay tubes, right? And clay is a really interesting brush. And the thing you need to know about clay and also clay tubes, they're both derived from the same kind of base brush, is that they work by selectively. I'm going to get rid of this. Actually, this thing has a transpose in it as well. I guess we'll leave it. and poly paint off. So they selectively fill in gaps rather than build up the surface. And this is probably hard to just understand abstractly, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an example. I will carve in, actually, I'm going to make it quite explicit. I'll go with a mask rectangle, and holding down Control, I'll make a rectangle. I'll invert this, and I will use the Move brush, and holding down Alt, I'm just going to push this in. Okay, so we've got a problem now. So smooth out the edges a tiny bit. So if I'm going with the clay brushes, what you need to know is that these guys selectively fill in the gaps, fill in cavities, right, before they fill in the surface. So you can see as I stroke in here, right in this corner, it looks at the surrounding area and decides whether it's a depression or an elevation or whether it's flat. And if it's a depression, it preferentially fills in the depression instead of bulging up the higher elevations, right? So as I put this in, you can see that it's filling in the gap before it starts to bulge out up here, right? And in the extreme, if I kind of do this across, here you can see that it's filled in the gap almost entirely. Right, so try to give you another example. Probably the back of a model's bum isn't the best place to do this, but we'll go with it. So as I stroke this in, you can see that even though my brush is overlapping on the sides considerably, it really wants to put into the cracks or the depressions first. And likewise, that's in Z add mode. If you're in Z subtract mode, what it does is it carves off the surface before it carves off the elevations, before it carves off the depressions. So it's really good for flattening things out. Right, so all of these ridges that I sculpted into her back, just put my polyframe on so you can see a little bit of the topology, the contours. It's a very controlled way to subtract those out, right? Because it's working in the extremes rather than the common surface of the model, right? So if I just run this along here, I'm just subtracting it out really nicely. And then this actually is a depression now, so if I leave Z add on and adjust my cursor size, I can just subtract that out. Right, so when it's looking to decide whether or not it should fill something in as a depression or cut off an elevation, it really depends on the size of your cursor when you start your stroke, right? So if you make it really small, like in here, it has no idea what is an elevation, or it has no idea of this, the surrounding walls. But if you make your stroke big, it realizes that it's in a depression, and it builds up and preferentially modifies that, but leaves the walls alone. Okay, so that's a really important lesson, is that you need to keep your brush stroke the right size for the kind of details you're trying to modify. We'll talk about the clay brush and the clay tubes a lot as we go, just because they're very, very controllable. They're very useful for building up the surface without artifacts, and I use them all the time, especially when I'm in Dynamesh mode. For just that reason, they do a great job of building up the surfaces. Okay, so we just go over to our Dynamesh lady, and with clay or clay buildup or any of the other clay derivatives, you can really just kind of build up the surface without too much artifact. Meaning artifacts being like lumps from the standard brush, right? You know, This is quite extreme, but as you stroke back and forth with a standard brush, because it's always moving along the normal and has no kind of controlling feature, no controlling functionality, you get all sorts of things happening. But if I took this mess that I've just made with the standard brush, and I went after it with the clay brush and make kind of a big stroke, I can easily kind of just ease this back into the surface, building up and pushing in. Right, because it's really kind of, it's a unifying brush. In that it doesn't really want to destroy. It wants to build up gradually. Right, so operation is almost complete. And a little smooth brush might fix things a bit. Okay, so one more thing I want to talk about with the clay brush is the modifier called embed. And the embed is essentially how much it fills in or how much it cuts off, right? If you're in negative, it's cutting off. If you're in positive, it's filling in. By default, it's 10. And the difference between clay and clay buildup brushes, if you ever look at clay and clay buildup, clay buildup has an alpha. Clay buildup has an alpha, but it also has a deeper embed, right? So if we wanted to mimic the functionality of clay buildup brush with just the standard clay brush, we could turn the embed higher to 20, or if we wanted to go ridiculous, we could go to, say, 100, and you can see that it just really whacks a lot of, almost uncontrollably pops things out. So I'm going to put that back down to standard, so say 20. Carve this back in. So you can see, you can get a lot of volume going when we have the embed. Likewise, if you turn the embed down to 0, which sometimes I'll do if I'm cleaning up a mesh, it essentially works like an eraser, in that it just kind of equalizes the surface. Right, so this is just pure embed at 0. So any cavities that it sees, it just pulls those up to the level of the surrounding mesh, right? And in subtract mode, it will push any kind of convexities down to the level of the surrounding mesh, but no deeper, right? So you can see what happens as I do multiple strokes on this. So the embed is really the magic modifier for the clay brush, clay-based brushes, right? So you can see actually between just with embed as 0 and pushing and pulling, Z add, Z subtract, you can really just clean off the surface of a mesh. This is going to be gross because I'm really destroying the topology, but it doesn't matter, we're in Dynamesh. So this is again with embed 0. And it really is just pushing those down to the surface around. And Dynamesh it. So control drag on the canvas. That's it. So we've just kind of erased those with embed 0. It almost resembles when you do this a flatten brush, which is a relative of this technique. Okay, so that's clay. And now on number 8 is clay tubes, right? This clay tubes really is nothing but clay brush with an alpha modifier. And I'll just show you a few things about this brush. I really like it. In fact, I love it. It's probably my main brush when I'm sculpting and building up form and surface, because I've kind of grown up drawing and everything as a crosshatcher, right? I pen and ink or even pencil. I crosshatch everything. And so clay brushes, clay tubes is great for me because I build up form that way. Right, so I lay down stroke after stroke, and it builds up quite readily. I want to show you, I'm going to switch over to the other mesh, which has a little bit higher resolution, so we can see a few things about the clay brush. Let's see, am I on the highest? On the highest, but we can do it with another subdivision. I'll just subdivide one more time. Again, hates recording mode, so divide. I don't really care about that line, that layer. Okay, so clay tubes is great. I really like it when it lays down silky smooth strokes, and some people may not have the same results when they use their clay tubes. Z intensity, I'll put that up to 19 or so, just to build up form a little more quickly. If you don't get silky smooth strokes like this, you may want to do this, and that is to go to the stroke palette and put your roll distance to something greater than 1. By default, the clay tube starts at 1, and when you're kind of working quickly, you start to see a lot of this, which is these perpendicular artifacts, alpha artifacts in your mesh, which I really, really don't like, because that's not how I want it to look. So those go away if you put your roll distance up to something higher. See the same thing, gives a nice smooth stroke. Loses a little bit of agility going side to side, but I don't ever go side to side, so generally mine are long, straight strokes to build up form. Another thing you can do, you can play with the alphas. So occasionally I'll use something besides the square alpha. Use a circular alpha. It just gives a different kind of end to the stroke. Not a big deal. But you can also blur out the alpha. So if I go back to the square alpha, you can see that the edge of the stroke can give you some stepping artifacts like this, because it's a sharp drop-off in the alpha menu. Sometimes, depending on what's happening with my mesh, I will go to modify and crank up the alpha blur to 10 or 15, and that kind of smooths off the edges a little bit more. Right, so gives a nice kind of smooth stroke with gradual buildup, and the edges aren't too stair-stepped. Okay, like we talked about with the clay brush, the embed modifier just makes it more. On every stroke, it makes it deeper. Right, so 10 is the default. If I'm really kind of building up form quickly, sometimes I'll put it to 20, and you can see it just really pops off the surface. Slightly different than just cranking up the Z intensity, because the depth has to do with how the embed has to do with how it reacts to the different levels that it sees. Right, that's what I was talking about with the concavities versus convexities. Okay, so this is quickly becoming a really big, gross deltoid, but you can see how easy it is to build up form. Likewise, if I'm getting down to subtle details, I can put the embed to 5 or something, and then it just does very gradual layering. You can see it takes a lot of work to actually get this to build something up. So this is for building really fine forms on top of other forms. All right, so I don't know what kind of detail I'm putting in here. Some kind of hybrid serratus anterior, but as I put this in, you can see I'm kind of building up convexity, a big kind of bulging surface using the clay brush. If I want to kind of heighten the strokes going this way, the clay brush isn't the right tool for the job. Right, this is where I combine my clay or clay tubes with my standard brush. Standard brush with the focal shift going small and intensity down. So get quite subtle. So this is where standard is really useful because it helps to push where the clay brush, the functionality of the clay and clay tubes kind of gets in the way, and that it has that bias towards concavity or convexity, right? But standard is unbiased, so it can really help you to refine your forms. And then pop back to clay just to refine some of the surface. Okay, so that's clay and kind of the modifiers that I use with it. Clay tubes, clay, speak of them together because they're the exact same thing, but just with a modifier, with an alpha modifier. Okay, so the last hotkey is the magic number 9, and right now 9 is not mapped to anything for me. I use it depending on what phase I'm in to bring other brushes into play. So sometimes I'll map polish. You know, if I'm working on eyelids or certain creases, polish is really good for tightening edges. So flattening surfaces and respecting the edges that you've already established. Right. So if I'm trying to make this look really kind of sharply cut off at the thigh, I could go in with polish. Very nice that way. So sometimes I'll map polish, sometimes I'll map, say, Z-project, if I'm doing something crazy like trying to pop out an eyeball and make it round. Sculpting a round eyeball is really hard if you're trying to keep it within a continuous mesh, so I'll sometimes just use the Z-project, and I have to do an example now. So let's just append a sphere. And where are you, sphere? Let's just find him. Sphere is right here, so I'll get it. I'll transpose it over. Say we're going to do something crazy. Like give her a massive thyroid problem. And we'll put that there. And I'll go back to this, and I can't see my transparents, but I can do them. So transparent ghost. And with Z-project, essentially it will project your current model and pop it out, turn it to Z-add to whatever the underlying subtool is. And it will stop at the limit of that subtool. But it only pulls along the surface normal towards the screen. Right? So if you wanted to make something round, you can't just pull the whole thing. You have to kind of rotate around. So this is, again, essentially just conforming her neck to the roundness of the sphere. Okay, That's going to be horrible, but you guys will get the idea of what is. Imagine this was an eyeball in the eyeball socket, and you get an idea of how I sometimes use Z-Project. The other way that I use Z-Project, let me just turn on solo. You can see what's happened. This is still a continuous mesh. I step down a subdivision. You can see that I can smooth it off. So I've introduced form that's really, really hard to create with just sculpting. The other thing that I use Z-Project for is for contact surfaces, right? So say she's sitting on something and her bum needs to squish out flat. You might append like a plane. And let me find where the plane is. It's back here. So I'll just transpose it over really quickly and give you guys a second example. So it's single-sided, so we aren't really seeing it. She's actually not sitting on it. She's going to be lying, sitting up against a wall, we'll say. Okay, so plane. Let's just do this for our own sanity. We will do double-sided, so we'll see it from front and the back. Okay, now Z-project this back to. So in this instance, it's kind of pressing her back up against this plane. So Z-project, I'll use sub mode, which is just the same brush with Alt enabled. So I'm getting Alt from my tablet and really just pushing this down. So that's pushing that down. You can pull up the adjacent areas by using it without the Alt modifier. This is going to pop up the other areas up to the surface of the plane. And then if I go to solo mode, you can see what we've done. So we've essentially stamped that in. And from here, you could do crazy things like maybe go to standard brush, stroke it along the outside like this to really make it feel like there's some flesh pushing out the side, varying amounts depending where you are. So you get the idea with Z-project. Use it sometimes for hand contact, where hand is touching the body. And this is like fat, big kind of hard push, so this is going to be a big roll. So I light a little bit. Got to have the right light for the task. Hands. Big skin roll pushed over the top. Okay, you get the idea. If I turn on this and if I turn off my transparency, you kind of see what's going on there with the skin pushed over the top. Cheap and cheerful. If anybody's seen The Little Mermaid that I did for Pirates of the Caribbean 4, you see her pressed up against the glass, and this Z-project is some of what I used for that. Right. Not rocket science, but it's a very useful tool for just kind of conforming your surface to something that's really hard to sculpt. Okay, so that's a quick tour of the brushes that I use most often. As we go through all these lessons, I will talk about other brushes that come into my workflow when I use them, but in general, this probably accounts for 95% of everything. I'll talk about transpose in the context of setting up our models, which is kind of a different brush. But as far as sculpting brushes, these are my go-to. So again, number 1 is standard, number 2 is move, number 3 is nudge, 4 pinch, 5 is inflate, 6 is morph, 7 is clay, 8 is clay tubes, and 9 is the wild card. Okay, so not really to impose these onto your workflow, because I'm sure everybody has some really cool things that they've already established, but this is how I do it. Okay, thank you.